Wes's long career in historic preservation has included senior staff positions with the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, New York Landmarks Conservancy, Preservation League of New York State, and New Jersey Historic Trust. Wes, thank you again for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you all for joining us tonight. This is a kind of a new venture for the Conservancy. We are most of our activities are being a sentinel and a steward for the Merritt Parkway itself. But during COVID, we were started to think, well, people are getting a little bit housebound, and it might be kind of fun to get out and use the Parkway as a roadway to take you to places that you might not be aware of in your own backyard. And Fairfield County has a wealth of architecture that's never really been compiled
I signed up for this
in
from
one
the
central
library,
place.
and it started a while ago at 6:30. The libraries,
Please mute yourself.
you can watch it. Sit up and watch it.
All right, I'll continue.
Okay, please.
It's got a wealth of architecture that has never really been compiled in one place. And the Parkway was designed for pleasant transit. And during the slowdown in the past year, which is thankfully coming to an end, the Parkway was actually a very pleasant place to drive. It wasn't all about commuting and getting to work on time. But these tours, we're calling them pleasant transits, are a way to look at things that put the Merritt Parkway in context, and maybe look at the building types themselves that put themselves as a whole in context. Tonight is about public libraries, which the development of the public library, let's see. Oh, there it is. Okay. The development of the public library coincided with the City Beautiful movement. And the Merritt Parkway is considered by many to be the last gasp of the City Beautiful movement, which really is the period of 1893 to about the outbreak of World War II. It was a period when architects, city planners felt that the built environment could be improved by improving the quality of architecture and generally creating landscapes and places that were interesting to people. So the libraries were coincided. Fairfield County's libraries almost perfectly overlap with that period. There are a few that predate it, but for the most part, they are the product of the City Beautiful movement. The City Beautiful movement basically stressed classical architecture that marked points in urban places that kind of defined space. There was a concept of ensemble, that these buildings worked together as major monuments, and then cities would kind of organically grow around them in a similar vein. And for the most part, in many of Connecticut's communities in Fairfield County, that's exactly what happened. So tonight we'll look at some of the keystone buildings, and they are our public libraries. And let me see. My controls do not seem to be working particularly well tonight.
Maybe it's just on a delay.
My arrow key doesn't work, and my right key doesn't work, and my left key doesn't work. So let's see what could be going on here. Claudia, can you advance the slides, and I can just...
I cannot, unfortunately. It has to be from your...
Okay.
Because I don't have a slideshow.
This isn't going to be much of a tour if we look at the slide all night, is it? Let's see what's going on here. Oh, okay. That worked that time. Good. All right. So we are going to be spending a little bit of time talking tonight about the Renaissance, because the period that was the City Beautiful movement is sometimes called the Second Renaissance Revival. Then when basically the first Renaissance revival occurred during the 18th and early 19th century, when there was an interest in building some of the first permanent classical buildings in the United States. The second period occurs in the Gilded Age, when there's a lot of accumulated wealth from industry that is being assembled by a few people who are patterning their lives after the Renaissance merchants. And there's an interest in patronage and philanthropy. And I think we'll start here with Renaissance Italy, with this drawing of Sixtus V receiving the plans for the Vatican Library from his architect Domenico Fontana. The Sixtus assembled at that point the largest collection of manuscripts that had developed that were out there, aggressively going after them to put them in one place, to preserve them and to make them accessible for scholars. And there wasn't really any sort of prototype for a building type to do this. And Fontana sort of developed basically a long rectangular building with a central reading room and storage on the sides. Okay, good. My controls are working now. This is another early example, and I think this is an interesting one. This was the Medici family library in Florence that was designed by Michelangelo. And this is at the very beginning of more than the one person who owns the books consulting them for scholarship. In this case, Michelangelo designed a series of pews with reading desks on them that the books were chained to the desk because the manuscripts were irreplaceably valuable. And the catalog was, as you can see on the image of the right, was scribbled on the side of the pew. So this is the beginning of the public library. You basically went down the pews, you found the book you wanted to find, and you sat there and read it as it was chained to the desk, so that you wouldn't take it away. Let me go back here. Whoop, I'm going in the wrong direction. All right, now my controls are hypersensitive. I'm sorry about that. So let's skip ahead to 19th century America. And pretty much that the building type that we call the modern library is still tied to what the Vatican and the Medicis were doing in Renaissance Europe, except that they're in a different garb. They're Gothic Revival. This is Henry Austin's Yale, the old library at Yale University. And it's very similar to the libraries we just saw, long, narrow reading room in the center and book storage off to the right. And we'll flash forward ahead a little bit more to the architect who is considered the progenitor of the modern American library, and that's Henry Hobson Richardson. This is one of his earliest buildings, the Wynne Memorial. It set the pattern for philanthropy for local public libraries. And Richardson really developed the plan of the modern library. But even in his early libraries, you can see that it's still a narrow reading room with book storage off to the right. They're no longer chained to the shelves, but that's pretty much what the libraries were. And on the image on the right is a view of a recent addition in 2019 to this building. These buildings were intended to be expanded. The architects who built them knew that at some point the books, if they went into the 100 years into the future, they would need to be expanded. And so there was an idea of expanding them. Richardson didn't really anticipate that with his first library, but he did with his later libraries. And this is a very successful addition that, let's see, that expanded the space and connects to the old building and differentiates itself from the old building. Now my controls are not working. Okay. Richardson's libraries weren't just libraries, though, and these early libraries basically provided space for a number of different cultural activities. So in the Wynn Library here, you can see that over on the left, there's a picture gallery and a museum. And many of Connecticut's libraries, and Fairfield counties in particular, were designed with multifunctions, as we'll see in a minute. So the earliest library in Fairfield County that's still standing is the Danbury Library. If you take the Parkway, you would want to take exit 40 if you're going northbound, or exit 49 if you're going southbound. And it is quite a drive, but it's a pretty drive, especially if you get off Route 7 and go up through Reading. It's really quite a beautiful drive. This building was designed by Danbury native Lorenzo Wheeler, who was an architect who went on to a very successful career in New York in several partnerships. But he was a hometown boy who designed this, and he designed it with a strong sensibility of the origin of the library in Renaissance Italy. So if you're looking for a side trip to visit sunny Tuscany, you might want to visit this library. It's really a fine example of Tuscan architecture as interpreted through an American lens. It is basically, the library was on the second floor, and the first floor was rented out as commercial space. And this was a pretty common pattern in the early phase of Connecticut libraries. Nobody really knew if the libraries would survive or not. And so you needed some rental income to support them. And if you look at the profile of this building, it's very similar to Austin's Yale University Library. It's got a central reading room and flanked by two side aisles there. But that's pretty much the end of the similarities there, because it's a very, very different building in character and feeling. It is Italianate in sensibility. The arches on the building are Florentine arches, and by that I mean that they are two different arch forms. The inner arch, the lower arch, is a round arch that's associated with Roman architecture, and the upper arch is a pointed arch, a very flat pointed arch that's associated with Gothic architecture. And they're banded with very, very deep polychromatic coloration. That's very characteristic of Siena, architecture in Siena. So it's a kind of a hybrid building that channels both cultures. The patrons of this building were the White family. They donated the land, and they paid for the construction of the building. The Whites, this is a very typical pattern in Connecticut. They were pioneers in the hat manufacturing industry in Danbury, and so this was the second generation. One of the members of the second generation who was remaining in Danbury as a hat manufacturer. His cousin was a hat dealer in New York City, who put their wealth and invested it in a library for the community. The public library movement, Danbury had been trying to get a library since pretty much the end of the American Revolution. But the public library movement was a kind of a new animal that sprang up in the 1850s with advancements in printing and growing immigrant population that needed to come up to speed in self-improvement and just what America was all about at that time. And so the libraries were thought of places as continuing adult education for the times. And so the Whites were facing were an influx of Canadian migrants from French Canada that were coming down to work in the hat industry, and also an early wave of Italian immigrants coming to work in the hat industry. And it addressed those demographic changes that were going on in the community. think I have to hit this key each time and drop down this menu. All right, so if you visit this library, take note of how Wheeler dealt with the ornament on it. It's very asymmetrical. If you compare these two columns, they're carved in the same style, but with very different profiles. It's a real feast for the eyes on this building. And if you look at the bottom of the arches on the lower right, you can see that those carvings don't match either, and it's very different all over the building. In the corner of the building, just as a kind of a sense of whimsy, he puts this tiny little dwarf column supporting really nothing but just a decorative device. And up in the gable end, there's a lot of polychromatic stonework up there in what's called marquetry, which is a kind of checkerboard pattern in the end of the gable. So it's a really delightful building to spend a couple of minutes observing. It's no longer the library. It's been adaptively reused as a music center in Danbury, which is appropriate because Danbury is the home to Charles Ives, and it makes sense in Danbury to have that there. Now,
Hey, Wes, can I interrupt for 1 second?
Sure thing.
Question specifically if White Street in Danbury was named after the same Whites that.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. I won't interrupt.
And Claudia, I have a whole bunch of messages that are on top of my screen that I'm having a hard time reading my screen. Like, this meeting is being recorded. I don't think I need to know that.
No.
But I don't know how to get rid of it either. Oh, there, I just sunk it down below.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Pequot Library is really one of Connecticut's great libraries, and certainly the most Richardsonian of the Fairfield County libraries. It's by an architect by the name of Robert Robertson, who was a very talented architect who worked in many different styles, largely in Romanesque Revival, which was the style of Richardson. But he also did work in the Japanese style, which is very unusual in American architecture. This one is located in Southport. And if you're going northbound on the Parkway, get off at exit 44 and southbound exit 46. Down in Southport, it's a gift of a family, a really interesting family, the Marquand family and the Monroe families, who were joined in marriage by Virginia and Elbert Monroe. And but the Marquands were from Southport. They were the third generation silversmiths who had left Southport 2 generations earlier to go to New York and made a fortune in New York City as trading silver and providing silver along the Atlantic coast. The first generation silver is depicted in the objects on the upper photograph, and the fancier later Victorian ones are on the bottom. So Virginia's uncle, who was also her guardian, her parents died when she was very young, left his money to her, and she decided to build a library in Southport. Elbert came from a family that had developed one of the first libraries that had a special collection in Concord, Massachusetts. And for that collection, his family was collecting the manuscripts of Thoreau, of Emerson, of the Alcotts, and getting them under cover. So it comes from 2 families that had a real strong interest in libraries. And they created a special collection at this library that is mostly housed at the Yale Beinecke now because they don't have the climate control at Pequot. But it's a very different kind of trajectory. It wasn't just a public library. It's a beautiful building. The detailing is exquisite. It is on the site of one of the last battles of the Pequot Wars, and it's named for that. Elbert happened to be also a member of Benjamin Harrison's Indian Commission and the federal government. And so it is apparently the first library named after Native Americans in the United States. The family did not name it after themselves, which is also very unusual at the time. It uses a lot of round arches. That's the signal of the Romanesque Revival style. And it was originally built to be more rectangular in plan, as shown by the very faint red line. That was the extent of Robertson's first iteration of the building as it was initially built. The stacks, these things that look like with the tiers on it, were taken apart in Richardson's libraries. They were separated from the reading rooms at this point. And because it was a special collection, they were controlled by the librarian. It wasn't open stacks like we're used to now. Like Richardson's library, it also had a multifunction purpose. It had a large auditorium over on the left-hand side, and then reading rooms over on the right. The stacks are really impressive in this building. They're the original stacks, and they were a gift, a secondary gift of another patron, the Wakeman family, who left it in memory of their daughter with the stained glass window by Tiffany at the end, representing two figures important, Caxton in the history of printing in the back. And these stacks have been meticulously restored, and and you can go in them now, and they house the regular collection of the Pequot. Just a detail of the stained glass and some of the ironwork, the bookends at the ends of the stacks. The main reading room is still pretty much as it looked when it opened. And one of the interesting features that Robertson put into this building is what's known as a Venetian window, which has had a long association with libraries since Venice. And it's at the end of the reading room. It's not really detailed like a classical Venetian window, but he snuck it in here anyway. The interior has undergone a number of changes over the years, but in the last 15 years has gone through an extensive restoration of removing some of paint finishes from woodwork that was originally unpainted, and it's really quite beautiful. And if you get a chance when things open up, the auditorium is a magnificent space. It's got great acoustics to hear a concert or a lecture. It is a real exciting space to enter and to just hang out in for a little while for some great art. Another library in the Richardsonian mode is a really lovely library in Shelton that is very loved by its community, the Plum Memorial Library. This was, if you're going on the Parkway, take exit 53 northbound and southbound. In both directions. It's pretty much the last exit when you get off the Parkway. It sits up on top of a hill overlooking downtown in a very prominent location. And this one has an interesting origin story too. It was a kind of a lifetime ambition for a local merchant by the name of David Wells Plum to build a library. He was also a state assemblyman, and he was a local elected official as well. To give to the community a public library. He didn't have enough money for it, but he left a large bequest in his estate on condition that the city the city, I believe it was the city of Shelton at that point, would basically take control of the library in perpetuity. So it's really one of our first municipal public libraries in Connecticut, and it is the first one in Fairfield County. And it set a new pattern of library model for libraries. Plum's, this is a brass or a bronze bas relief that's in the entry lobby. So Plum is very well remembered in the building. The building was designed by, and he died before it was finished, and his wife actually finished the construction of the building in his name, Louise Wakely Plum. The building is designed by a local architect, Charles Beardsley, who also did the Fairfield Library, very different in a very different style. And Beardsley had been trained by Henry Austin, who had done the Yale Library. And it's polychromatic, like we saw in Danbury, but with a more somber, muted tone that is Romanesque Revival as well. It's got some wonderful, unique carving in it. The lettering over the front library, that's actually terracotta, imitating brownstone. But there is a wonderful little brownstone inserted plaque up on the tower that says Lux and Lex, light and law, translated from the Latin. On the interior, there's some wonderful interiors. The building has been enlarged since then, so this is no longer the main reading room. It's kind of a special events room, but it has a wonderful Richardsonian fireplace and some stained glass windows that had been used as a dividing screen between two of the rooms, and they were recently reinstalled with artificial backlighting to really show them off to their best effect. This building is very well loved. It was extended in 1973 by a very sensitive addition that connected to the older part of the library and increased the capacity about 12-fold in terms of the volume of books it could handle. Another Richardsonian library is in Stratford. This is also exit 53, whether you're going northbound or southbound. You just get off and just drive down Main Street and you'll come right by this library. This has got an interesting story too. It's another sort of parting gift to the community by someone who grew up in Stratford and made his fortune in New York. And when he basically gave up his property in Stratford, he bequested the library that the community had been trying to build for a number of years. William Birdseye Blakeman was a publisher. He published textbooks, which are visible up in the upper right-hand corner. They were, popular school textbooks, and they weren't very expensively bound, but they were very, very extensively used throughout the United States. The architect was William H. Miller, who was from Ithaca, New York. And you might ask, why would Birdseye Blakeman go all the way to Ithaca to hire an architect? Well, Miller had just completed the main library on the Cornell University campus, which was a new type of planning for library architecture. And you can see in the kind of outer massing of the building that the Stratford Library, which is a much, much smaller building, is very similar to the Cornell Library. On the interior, Miller arranged the stacks on the perimeter, but because it was a cross-shaped plan, the students could have access much without wandering around long corridors to get to the books directly. This was an open shelf system that was used at Cornell, and these wonderful stacks were connected by these flying bridges that crossed the reading room. In the Stratford Library, the space was much smaller, but I could still handle 200 patrons in the reading room at once, with a lot of room in these little niches off the side. Over on the right, you can see that there are no books, but that was built for future expansion of books. The library got extended. This one extended not with connected additions at first, but by a second pavilion that was similarly massed, donated by the Sterling family, the same family that donated the Sterling Library at Yale. And then later, those two wings were connected at the back by a late 20th century addition. Those were the Richardsonian libraries. Even though some of them were built just slightly after 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago changed the way that people looked at public libraries and changed the way public buildings looked in the United States. And it was the first exposition of a generation of architects who had been trained in Europe and were well versed in classical architecture. And it was visited by hundreds of thousands of Americans who left here just impressed by this beautiful city that they had seen. And in fact, it was right after this that the Macmillan Plan in Washington, D.C. goes in, and Washington de-Victorianizes itself and begins to build these wonderful marble buildings on the mall. But it also had an impact on smaller cities as well as libraries in bigger cities. So two of the major works of this period are McKinley White's Boston Public Library, 1895. Charles Follen McKim, one of the partners of McKinley White, had been trained by Henry Hobson Richardson, and he was one of the planners of the Chicago World's Exposition. He modeled his library, the Boston Public Library, on a Florentine palazzo as a complete break with Richardsonian tradition. This is a very, very symmetrical, staid, academic building, and a beautiful building. I had the pleasure of going to college for a couple of years in Boston, and I got to know that library very well, and I still love it to this day. And the one that I really love that I still use is Career and Hastings, New York Public Library. This is a slightly different bent. Career, the partner, had been trained by McKim and took classicism one step further, which was really where libraries went in Fairfield County. And that was towards the Neo-Palladian phase. Now, when I talk about Neo-Palladianism, Andrea Palladio was a 16th century architect based in Venice, who was probably the greatest Italian architect of the Renaissance and changed the way that that classicism was interpreted in England and all English-speaking countries, and had a major impact in France as well. And this is a very Neo-Palladian building. It's got a center block and two pavilions connected to it by hyphens. And in this case, New York Public, it has a very kind of Roman triumphal arch entrance at the front of it. That's a very non-Palladian element, but the major form of the building is Neo-Palladian. So Neo-Palladianism would come to influence what Fairfield County libraries look like. But the first iterations of libraries built after the fair did not necessarily look like New York Public or Boston. In fact, one of the most interesting ones to be built no longer stands. It was the gift of Elizabeth Milbank Anderson, a philanthropist of great magnitude. She built public baths in New York. She built the first building at Barnard College at Columbia. And she, as a gift to Greenwich, which was her summer home, she gave a library. And it's a classical building, but notice that it's asymmetrical. So it's very Richardsonian in feeling, in that Richardson was not planning buildings to fit programs within symmetry. He was planning buildings to fit the function that they needed to fit. The architect here is Charles Alonzo Rich, who was the Milbank family architect, so to speak, a very underappreciated architect today. His work is much better than he's remembered today. He did a lot of work at Dartmouth, a lot of the major buildings there. And this building was a sort of a Greek Revival homage to classicism, but the asymmetry seemed to displease the people of Greenwich. And in the 1940s, they remodeled the library to make it symmetrical. But it wasn't entirely successful as a symmetrical facade. This was on Greenwich Avenue, on the site where Saks is today. And in the 1960s, the library decamped up to Putnam Avenue to put in their new buildings, which have expanded by several additions since then. So sadly, this building is gone, but it does not seem to have been loved by the community for its asymmetry. It was a little bit too far ahead of its time of modernism. But more typical of the Second Renaissance Revival libraries is the Elizabeth W. Morris Memorial in Ridgefield. This was a gift by a summer resident to the Ridgefield community in memory of his wife. It was a very small building. It was probably the smallest of the libraries we'll see tonight, except for perhaps one, in its first iteration. And it was very, very carefully designed, carefully detailed. The architect was an architect by the name of Raleigh C. Greensleeve, who was Gildersleeve, who was born in Virginia and educated at Johns Hopkins, and did a lot of work on the Princeton University campus. I don't know how he got this commission but this would have been a commission that the patron of the library would have awarded to the architect directly. This library has been very successfully expanded by Newman Architects recently with a very large addition that both respected the original building and brought in a very modern library that is really quite a lovely building itself. And this is what the library looks like from the front today. Couple of details to note here. By 1901, the Carnegie Foundation was funding libraries, and a lot of small town libraries began to develop lamp standards symbolizing enlightenment at the outside of the buildings, and also a flight of steps. Carnegie liked to see people walk up a few steps, feeling that they were being uplifted as they went into the library, which has proven to be a problem with adapting to the Americans with Disabilities Act in some cases. It's very sensitively attached to the old building and the new addition to the old building, and it's just a very pleasant addition. Another building of this kind of early neoclassical Renaissance revival mode is the South Norwalk Public Library. And this was a Carnegie library. The Carnegie funded a number of libraries in Fairfield County. I believe they funded a total of 6, 2 in Norwalk and 4 in Bridgeport. And this is perhaps the most interesting classical iteration of the Carnegie libraries. It's what would be called an eclectic building, because it combines elements of Greek Revival architecture and Roman Revival architecture in one building, which was never really done in the Italian Renaissance, but it was occasionally done in the American Renaissance. And the Greek elements here are the features that project above the triangular pediment on the front of the building. An acroterion is the feature right at the peak. And then there are 2 lamps that Carnegie liked to symbolize learning at the bottom of the library. And the other Greek Revival elements are the grillwork windows at the second floor, and basically the extensive use of rectilinear openings throughout, except for the beautiful arched opening at the entrance. We'll look at other iterations of this profile of the entrance in a minute, because it was a very typical one used in many libraries. Carnegie, as I mentioned, also followed the kind of Plum idea that he offered to build the building if the town would support it going forward. And he didn't demand that the town support the libraries to the full extent, but that they at least put an annual appropriation of 10% of the library's operating cost into the budget going forward. Carnegie really changed the landscape of private philanthropy in Fairfield County, because once he started coming in as an outside force, he left a number of libraries without really solid, strong patrons. There were still a few built after Carnegie, but the way that buildings got built started to change. And just a couple of details, the lamps outside of this library that Carnegie liked. And on those curved wings on the side, the architect here used Roman brick, which in the shadow on the curve really creates this wonderful basket weave pattern and shadow play on the side of the building. The other Carnegie Library is an earlier one, and that is the Norwalk Public Library. At the time, Norwalk and South Norwalk were two separate municipalities. So they applied for competing funds. They got them around the same time, but it took South Norwalk a little bit longer to build their library. So South Norwalk is the newer of the two. This is a real outlier in terms of style in Fairfield County. It is different. It was designed, for one thing, by a firm of English architects, W&G Owdsley, who were known primarily for residential architecture. And this building has a real kind of residential domestic feel to it. It's a very intimate building. It's also the only one done in what is occasionally called the Jacobean style or the Elizabethan style or the Tudor style. It's really not, it wouldn't be mistaken in any of the periods prior to the arrival of classicism in Great Britain as anything but a modern building that really looked very different from anything in those styles. But the half timbering, the tiny panes of leaded glass, and the kind of tapered pilasters at the archway at the entrance are giveaway features for that style. It's a very, very finely detailed building by a firm that was known for very careful detailing. And it also, like the Danbury Library, it has a Victorian feel, even though it's 30 years after the Danbury Library. It uses permanent polychrome to express different things. Those aren't painted black bands that wrap the building. Those are actually black bricks that wrap the building. And like the other libraries, it too has been expanded with an addition in the back. And this is a pretty typical addition from the 1980s or 70s and 80s to accommodate wheelchair access into the and just general access without having to go up the steps. You can see that the front steps of the original library were taken off, and that front room is still pretty well preserved, but it's not the front entrance of the building anymore. So just a couple of things to review before we go into the more colonial revival expressions of classicism. Colonial revival was especially well suited for the kind of places that Connecticut was at the turn of the century. One of our local architects here basically said it should be the adopted style that is used to express the City Beautiful movement for the kind of small villages that we had in Connecticut at the time. And the architects took that very seriously. I mentioned before that this is the second Renaissance revival. The first Renaissance revival was really in the 18th century. And the first library, specific purpose library building built in the United States was in Newport, the Redwood Library by architect Peter Harrison, who built this. He wasn't trained as an architect. He was actually trained as more of an accountant, but he had access to architectural books, and he also had a great eye. And he built the Redwood Library out of wood. This was not a public library. This was a private library, a society library where it was more like a club. You joined it, and then you had access to the books. And it was very, very influenced by Palladio. It was really the first phase of Neo-Palladianism in the United States. Up in the upper left is a facade that was designed by Lord Burlington, who is the leader of the English Neo-Palladian movement in the United Kingdom. He dominated the field of architectural design for a century. And you'll notice that one of the features that we most often associate with Palladio is the Venetian window, which is the three-part window in the center of the composition that is flanked by, it's an arched window in the center flanked by two rectilinear windows in the center. It was considered in Roman times to be a synthesis of Greek and Roman architecture because the Greek system of architecture was based on post and lintels, and the Roman system of architecture was based on arches. And during the Roman Empire, the Romans recognized that they had a lot of cultural, their culture was derived in both thought and a lot of ethics and principles in government from the Greeks. And so they saw themselves as a kind of a Greco-Roman culture. Harrison used the same motif based on Burlington's printed edition of one of his, of that building on the upper left on the Redwood Library at the bottom center, which we'll be seeing a lot of in Fairfield County libraries. And the library on the right is William Thornton's Philadelphia Library, 1790. And that is also a Neo-Palladian building that is basically taking its cues from the center pavilion of the great estate in the United Kingdom up on the top, where you have a large front portico like Redwood, and here it's been flattened and put into the facade. And if you remember the image of the New York Public Library, the building up in the upper right is more or less what the New York Public Library was built on, a Neo-Palladian profile of a building. Fairfield County's first memorial library is Fairfield's Library. As I mentioned before, was designed by the same architect of the Plum Library. If you're going to visit this, you'll want to take heading northbound exit 46 and heading southbound exit 44. It was conceived originally as a very standalone building, but it was intentionally built to be expanded in the back. It's unusual from the other libraries we've been seeing in Fairfield County in that it's a full 2 stories. And the interior had reading rooms and fireplaces on the first floor. And on the second floor, there was space for the stacks and to be expanded later on when the building was expanded for new stacks space in the back. They were converted to these lovely interior rooms that are used by the public. So very Neo-Palladian in the treatment of the central figure, window above the original front entrance to the building. Very, very nice detailing with corner coins. Those are the blocks that kind of go in and out at the corner of the center block there, and a very beautifully bracketed, detailed pediment above the front entrance. These are the rooms upstairs. The room on the right is now called the Rotary Room, but it's kind of a memory of Fairfield history done
Memorial
in
room, sorry, memorial room.
Memorial Room, sorry, okay. Thank you, Claudia. It remembers a lot of Fairfield's history. The room on the left is a small meeting room that was designed by architect Norman Isham, who was an early colonial revivalist. It's very carefully detailed. There are cabinets that are placed, the glass cabinets on the right of the room there are behind the Palladian window on the front. So the Palladian window doesn't actually light anything in this room, but it's a charming little meeting room. And like the other buildings, it has been expanded. The building has been expanded out the back all the way to the north. This building faces south. So if you run along the post road to the behind the building, The building then turns the corner on the block and comes around and meets the new addition here. So it forms a large center, basically occupies the whole block now. It's a very large library, maybe one of the biggest in Fairfield County. And the newest addition by Newman Architects is a really wonderful light-filled space. One that doesn't look at first glance as Colonial Revival is the former Westport Public Library. This is accessible northbound by exit 41, southbound by exit 42. It is clearly a neoclassical building, but what makes this Colonial Revival is the treatment of the main motif on the front block that projects out. It's a pedimented opening that is flanked by two large, or what are called giant columns that expand the full 2 stories of the building. And then it carries what appears to be a flat cornice, but is actually a hip roof up above it. This is based on one of Palladio's buildings, or actually a motif that Palladio developed, where he placed very large columns flanking very narrow pedimented window openings in Vicenza, where he was from, a little hill town above Venice. And Inigo Jones, who was the first architect in Great Britain to practice in the classical mode. He's considered to be the progenitor of all classicism. Visited Vicenza, saw this building and others, saw the architect Scamozzi, who finished this building, spoke with him, and came back and for King James I, built the first classical building in the United Kingdom. England had no history of classicism prior to Inigo Jones. And Jones's career was interrupted by the Civil War. And so classicism came to a grinding halt during that period of time. But you can see the same motif there. And if you compare them, you can see the development of the form. So this is an arrangement. We've seen this already on 2 or 3 buildings, but it's most prominent on the Westport Library. I don't know the architect of this library, but the patron was Morris Ketchum Jessup, a very successful financier in New York, who basically retired after at a very young age, and spent the last 25 years of his life as a philanthropist. And Jessup grew up in Westport, but most of his life was spent in New York. And he was one of the founders of the Museum of Natural History, and spent much of his remaining 25 years of his life as the building up the Museum of Natural History collection. The detailing on this building, though, was really quite robust and very, very Palladian in character. Ferguson Library is a library that's very dear to my heart. I grew up with this library. I grew up in Stamford. I didn't have to take the Merritt to this library, but if you want to visit this library, I suggest you do. Take exit 34 northbound and exit 35 southbound. It's right in the center of downtown Stamford. It is not the largest building in downtown Stamford, but is probably the most impressive building. It really leaves an impression. You know you're in the center of town. It's definitely a landmark feature. This is a kind of a hybrid, and it's also associated with the Merritt Parkway in a very unusual way. John Day Ferguson, a Stamfordite, left behind a bequest that wasn't enough to actually build the building, which is a very Neo-Palladian building. And so there was a building committee formed, and Schuyler Merritt, who the Merritt Parkway is named after, was the head of the building committee for this building. So he needed to raise the funds on top of Ferguson's bequest. Egerton Swartwout was a native of Indianapolis, but he had family in Stamford, and he was sent to Stamford at a young age to attend a school here, eventually went to Yale, and eventually went to work for Charles McKim at Mckinley White, and eventually formed his own firm. And he's the architect trained by McKim and White, Stanford White as well. And this is a very complicated building that received notoriety being published in Scientific American early on. This is the floor plan that was clearly hand sketched for Scientific American of the layout of the library as it originally appeared, much smaller than it is today. The portico is down at the bottom of this image, and then on the right is a section through the building. And the arrows are pointing at the way that the architect brought in indirect light into the center of the building although on the outside of the building, it looks like it's got a flat roof. It's actually a very, very complicated roof that was intentionally done that way to bring light into the interior of the building. This was what the entry hall looked like originally. And the window, the lunette on the left, is some of that indirect light spilling into the main entrance hall. As you entered the building through the front door and went straight ahead, you were confronted with the stacks. These were not ornamental stacks like they were at Pequot. By this point in time, 20 years after Pequot, there were several manufacturers of prefabricated stacks, metal stacks. This was a 3-tier system that went up into a clear-story level of the building. And each of the floors here were done with cloudy glass. And it was translucent, and you had this feeling in those original stacks of kind of floating on clouds. I just loved being up there as a kid. It was a real trip. This was the original reading room, which is the room off to the right, and the arrows pointing in the direction that the photograph is taken back towards the stacks. So from the reading room, you could just walk over the stacks and grab a book. And the librarian's office was parked over there in the right-hand corner. The room still pretty much looks like that today, although it's not furnished that way. It still has all of its architectural features, and it's still a delightful room to just hang out and read some periodicals. And the entry lobby still, without the circulation desk and without the stacks behind it, still looks very much like it did when the building was originally built. This building is much loved, and the library itself is much loved by the community. It's a real vibrant center of town. On the left is what the plaza looks like today with several. It's got about 5 additions that have been made to it, a very modern one in the front. But still there's great care and great respect given to the original core of the library, which is here the mayor and Alice Knapp, the director of the library, are cutting a ribbon to celebrate the reopening of the plaza and the restoration of the portico after a pretty bad fire on the portico a couple of years ago. Now up to New Canaan. This is a really wonderful Colonial Revival library too, but in a very different sensibility. And this one has perhaps the most unusual backstory of any library in Fairfield County. It's New Canaan was a terminal of a branch line of the railroad. The railroad was sent up there to serve industry originally, but the industry was already on its way out. And so realtors came into town and decided to translate all that wonderful pastoral scenery into real estate. This building is built at that moment when New Canaan starts to transition into a suburban community from an industrial agricultural basis of its economy. And perhaps more than any other library in Fairfield County, this one tells the story. That's the story of Fairfield County, really, in general. I mean, it took some communities longer to do it, A couple of communities were already transitioning before New Canaan, but this building really sums it up for a number of reasons. Part of its backstory is that this one didn't really have a large bequest behind it. So the community had to really pull together to fund it. These are obituary headlines. I don't want to be a downer here, but the people in green are longtime residents of New Canaan that were on this committee. The people in the kind of bluish teal color, they were people that had come into the community with this wave of newcomers that the train brought up to New Canaan at the time. And they mixed with the community very well to accomplish this objective. And so it was a way of the library provided them with an opportunity to pull together. The library was that they had at the time was a building that was really built as just a commercial building. And similar to Danbury, it had retail on the first floor. In this case, the advertiser printing presses were on the first floor, which wasn't exactly a quiet use. And they were located next to stables and saloons in a kind of an edge of town that was, sort of dying industrial. So it wasn't a very attractive place for a library. And the founders of this building had to pull together. Henry Warren was the chair of the building committee. He had actually attended the 1893 Columbian Exposition, came back and was really excited about it. And so he was kind of leading the charge on this. Francis Green was the realtor who pulled together a summer colony that eventually became a year-round colony in New Canaan. Francis Weed was a Civil War veteran who had been a prisoner of war and came back, became the founder of Weed and Duryea and a local politician, and was a very beloved hero. Charles Hubble was a newcomer to town. He was a contractor who moved into town. While he was in New Canaan, he transitioned into an artist. His storage barn for building buildings became his studio. He went off, spent the rest of his career in the West Coast, but he was on the building committee and eventually painted the murals that were in the library. We'll see those in a minute. And Olive Remy, the little name there, she's a really interesting character too. She was one of Helen Keller's tutors who tutored her in German. And it was Helen Keller always credited Olive Remy with getting her into college. So they were a really interesting group of people. They did a number of different interesting fundraising things. La Fiesta was a townwide event where they did these pageantry-like dances that involved like lots of kids and lots of families where the newcomers mixed with the old timers. Everybody got to know each other and feel comfortable with each other. This was really the seminal moment of the building of the New Canaan community, and it was centered on this building. And the other really extraordinary thing about this building is that this is the first library building in Fairfield County that is built as a result of an architectural competition, and the architects who competed all lived in New Canaan. So having 6 resident architects in 1913 who all had a Beaux-Arts orientation, either because they had attended the École de Beaux-Arts, or they had been in partnership with someone from the École, or they had been trained by someone from the École, was a pretty extraordinary thing. So there's a lot of brain trust here that went into this competition. And the other unusual thing is that most of them had been trained either directly or indirectly by Charles McKim or H.H. Richardson. So these were the leading figures in American library architecture at the time that had trained this group of 6 people. It's a really phenomenal story. The winning competitor, that they submitted their entries anonymously, so that the judges didn't know who they were, who were the authors of the different designs. And the winner was Alfred H. Taylor, who had been trained by someone who had apprenticed under Richardson. Taylor's design is really interesting. It looks deceptively simple, but it's got a lot of really unusual architectural ideas in it. And it was executed very much like Taylor's drawing. If you remember that Palladian window we looked at earlier, that was on Redwood Library, it appears here overlooking the main, most decorative interior room of the library, over to the far right of this photograph. But the front elevation also played around with the Palladian window, the Venetian window motif, in a very sophisticated way. So there's the really focal element of the exterior, the redwoodish Palladian window. And here, if you look at the way that the windows are arranged here, they're arranged as three groups, each centered on an arched opening with that horizontal rectilinear window flanking them. And the proportions of these were derived from a published work that goes back to, again, Lord Burlington, the Neo-Palladian English architect, his own house at Chiswick. And the proportions line up perfectly for what Taylor was trying to accomplish. Now, one of the really interesting things about, another interesting thing, there are many interesting things about this building, but the committee, the building committee, was the committee that made the decision on the selection of the architect and the design. And the committee had an advisor, William Boring, who was the architect of the main immigration station at Ellis Island, which was considered a real masterpiece. He had also been trained by McKim, and a real masterpiece of Renaissance Revival design, with a large Diocletian window, which you can also see at the top on Chiswick House on the dome here, on the drum of the dome. So I think they were all playing. We don't know what the other five entries were, but they had to have been really great. But this one was the one that won the day. On the south end, this was the room that overlooked the stacks. Taylor also riffed on the Palladian motif again in a very utilitarian way. At this point, the same way that Lamb did in the Greenwich Library, where he expressed the stack on the outside to the displeasure of the Greenwich residents, but also the same way that Carrier did on the New York Public Library. If you go around to the back of the New York Public Library, the window openings are very, very linear and utilitarian. And so Taylor was doing that here. Taylor had never designed a library before. He was known primarily for bank architecture, but he was a really good architect. And Taylor got the kind of colonial feeling through a very, very, it looks on the surface to be very primitive, but these stones are really carefully fitted into one another. But he captures this feeling of a vernacular building that's built with local stone to capture this kind of primitive feeling of colonialism. So he's got these sophisticated ideas wrapped in this very rugged setting. It's a really remarkable building. The interior, these are Hubbell's lunettes, the murals up at the top. This is now today called the Sallant Room. And it was built for the New Canaan Historical Society as their first home. And then later, when the New Canaan Historical moved out, the library took it over. It was the director's office for a while. And then it became a kind of a quiet reading room in the library. And it's still a charming room today in very, very good condition. You should visit this building soon because this building is endangered. And right now, there's an application up before Planning and Zoning in New Canaan that would replace this building with a lawn. And it's really too good a building to meet that fate but you should, if you're interested in seeing it, see it sooner than later. The Gene Clemens Memorial, or the Mark Twain Library in West Reading, is another type of colonial revival. I think one that many people think that most American colonial revival is. It's a very vernacular expression of colonial revival architecture. This is what it looked like early on in the interior of the reading room, and this is pretty much what it looks like today. But Clemens had built this house for his daughter, who died unexpectedly, and then using his fame, helped fundraise to establish a library in West Reading for the community. And it's a charming place to visit. On to something completely different now is the Bridgeport Public Library system, which is more than just a public library, but it's really an entire urban system, similar to New York, Boston, and Chicago, with branch libraries. The library started out in basically an adaptive reuse of an old mercantile building, very similar to the warehouse buildings you'll see in Soho today. The Burroughs family, they were merchants, and Catherine Burroughs Pettingill gave to the library the building itself, which wasn't really set up for a building, but it pretty much served a function for a time. They found that as Bridgeport was rapidly growing in the 19th century, they decided to establish a system of branch libraries that were at first serviced by motorcycles. They would bring books from the main branch out to the main location, out to the branches, as requested by patrons in the neighborhoods. This is the main branch. It was built in 1925. It's similar, but a kind of a starved classic form of the Boston Public Library on a smaller scale. It has classical detailing, the giant columns that we saw from Inigo Jones' banquet house. And the back of the library is very similar to what New York Public Library is with the stacks, very, very utilitarian and unornamented. The Burroughs, the interior of the main branch did have a very graceful staircase, like the Fergusons and other libraries of the previous decades, leading up to the second floor. But once you were on the second floor, it's a very modern space in 1925. There was no sense of articulating this as a classical space, but there's a real spareness. And this is very much in the aesthetic of the Merritt Parkway, too. The way that this was articulated in the building. The main, just some images of the main catalog, which was huge. This was the largest public library system in Fairfield County, and the stacks there. The branches were largely done with Carnegie funding in two waves. There was a Carnegie grant in 1918 that created these two libraries. Again, with the banqueting house, Inigo Jones banqueting house, giant column entrance motif. The one on the right is more arts and crafts. And the South Branch, all sort of riffing a little bit on colonial revival. The finest of these, though, was the West Branch, also known as the Sanborn Branch, which was very much like the Ferguson in character and scale, and sadly was surplus by the library. Very, very beautiful interior, and was demolished a couple of years ago. And I think Fairfield County is still reeling from the loss of this library. There just seems something wrong about taking down a library. The Perrott Library is a memorial library in Old Greenwich, is probably the last of the colonial revival libraries in Fairfield County. This is at the other end of the parkway, northbound or southbound, take exit 31. This is also linked in a very unusual way to the Merritt, in that the Binney family basically gave the land for Binney Park, and this was a landscape feature that was set within Binney Park And the Binney, Helen Binney Kitchell, was one of the fiercest advocate for the creation of the Merritt Parkway as a parkway without billboards. She was an anti-billboard person, and she was also in the state assembly. She walked through a lot of the legislation to get the parkway established. And this building is contemporary with the Merritt Parkway. So it's a real period piece, simpatico period piece. Basically, Perrott Library was named after the first teacher in colonial Old Greenwich when it was called Sound View, and it was funded by two of their descendants, Annie DeCamp Porter, who's depicted on the right, and Annie Mae Hegman, who's depicted with the architect on the right. The left is D. Everett Wade, the architect, who was a very interesting architect, and this was very outside of the normal scope. He was known for skyscrapers, but he was also a patron as well because he donated the land. He was actually a resident of Old Greenwich and donated the land that this building was built on. This is the center image is one of Wade's most famous projects, a building, one of the most famous buildings that was never finished, which was the Metropolitan Life Tower, the North Tower. The old Metropolitan Life building on the right. MetLife was growing at such a fast clip in those days that they needed more space for administration and all the life insurance policies they were dealing with. But the Depression truncated the building on the right, and that's what it looks like today, which is still a very unusual building. But this was more akin to his style. However, there are some similarities. If you look at this building, you can see that the MetLife Tower was a series of setback tiers, sort of like seating hat boxes set on one another. And at the library, he does the same thing with the main entrance, which is an octagonal space that is surmounted by an octagonal drum of a lunette. He basically felt that he derived this from Monticello, and Monticello does have an octagonal drum at the base of the dome. And if you look behind the portico at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, the front facade is pushed out to suggest the hatbox kind of stack that he did here. So you have to stretch it, you have to imagine it a little bit to see what he was talking about, but it is a sort of an interesting riff on Jefferson and Monticello. And Jefferson's Monticello was one of the great Neo-Palladian buildings in the United States. The interior of the rotunda is really quite exquisite. The detailing is very unusual and elegant. This was the original children's room, which Wade basically, he waived his fee for designing the building on condition that the children's room be named after the Wade room after his late wife. And recently, a new children's edition has been put on the building, attached to the original building by this wonderful flying bridge. And it is a really cool interior, conceived of as a town green, complete with little miniature buildings inside for kids to hang out in. This was the gift of patrons, the Radcliffes, who gave the funds for building this library. We're going to jump to two last buildings here before we take questions, and I probably rambled on a little bit longer than you've bargained for. But two buildings that postdate the Parkway, and in some ways may have been created by the Parkway because the Parkway helped people the northern part of Fairfield County in a very unusual way. Weston Public Library is a real interesting modern building. Northbound or southbound exit 42 will take you there and not a very long trip. It's by one of Fairfield County's, another Fairfield County underappreciated architect, Joseph Salerno. If you know the Rowayton United Church, the one that's sort of spiral based on a nautilus form, he was the architect of that. And this is a really interesting library. By the 1960s, really in the 1920s, libraries were starting to diversify and specialize in terms of their collections inside. You would have a science area, you'd have, it had to do with a lot of cataloging, but it also had to do with media. Recordings were coming in the 1920s, but by the 1960s with computers, there was even more need for specializing. So Salerno envisioned this building as a bunch of very flexible pavilions that could house different aspects of the collections, all using the same vocabulary, all using a very simple modernist vocabulary that is widely used in really good modernism in Fairfield County. Fieldstone, native fieldstone with a lot of glass associated with it. It's a really beautiful campus. And then Wilton Library, exit 40 northbound, exit 41 southbound, is another building by one of New Canaan's leading modernist architects, Eliot Noyes. The original library building is now a bank. It's been repurposed as a Bank of America building, and it's very true to Noyes's form, which was very planar, box-like massings and different depths and experiences going in and out of the buildings. The library quickly outgrew this. This one doubled the size of an earlier building, but the library quickly outgrew this one. And Tai-Soo Kim Partnership built a new library across from it, which basically riffs on the vocabulary of the original Noyes building in 1975. One of the major features here is Dave Brubeck's piano, which opens up on a sliding glass partition for concerts out on a small central green, which is really quite a beautiful space. So I would just like to conclude. I imagine some of you may have taken a glass or two during the tour here. You don't have to drive, so that's very good. But I would like to make a toast in the spirit of this 1908 toast that deals with the future and the past and the present becoming the past very soon, and raise a toast to all the patrons and all the people that came before us that built these really remarkable buildings. And they left us a great legacy. It's our responsibility to steward them properly, and here's to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Wes. That was wonderful. Before I lose you all, I just want you to know Wes is coming back one more time. We're going to do June 9th. You want to tell them a little bit about that talk?
Sure. The next tour we're going to take is going to look at a very small cross-section of houses of worship, which are another important benchmark of communities and how they evolved over time. We're going to look at how the building type itself was interpreted by different denominations, but also just how the building type. So it's going to go from basically early Republic, because those are the earliest ones we have in the county, up to the modern period.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Wes. I mean, and now I want to go visit every single one of these libraries. I have to tell you,
I do too.
When Wes came to our library, we were learning new things that very day. So thank you all for attending tonight. We don't have time for a Q&A, but I hope you enjoyed it. And I think, Wes, you gave us so much information. There probably aren't a lot of questions.
Oh, yeah, let me give one last slide. So if you want to know more about the Parkway, feel free to get in touch with me at Wes at Merritt Parkway. I'll send you a free guide to the Merritt Parkway. Or if you have questions, you want to follow up with me on tonight's presentation. And I'm sorry I went on too long.
No, you did not at all. It was so interesting. You have so many thank yous in the chat. And also, Wes did drop a few of those maps to us at the Fairfield Public Library. So if you want to stop in and get one of those from us, we can do that too. So thank you to all for attending and sticking with us. This was a wonderful night. Thanks, Wes. Good night, everybody.
You're welcome. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thanks for coming. Wes, you should take a peek at the map before we shut it down.